of any potential bubble right now except real estate in coastal urban cities in China and the long government bonds in the United States. And I'm not sure it is, not yet. But those are the only two serious manias I see anywhere in the world. There may be others. So I'm just starting to short in a small, gingerly way some of the indexes in the U.S. as a protective or defensive measure. If you know of any great excesses, let me know, because I would short them instead of just taking a defensive posture.
What about food stores globally? Is there a potential crisis waiting to happen there, Jim?
Well, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, is going around the world from government to government explaining that we may have a horrendous food crisis facing us, agricultural crisis facing us. They would probably know better than most people. And if they're right, yes, who knows what's going to happen? You know, we have a shortage of farmers developing in many countries in the world, much less shortages of fertilizer and tractors and seeds, and have a shortage of tractor tires developing, for that matter. So conceivably, we're going to have serious food problems or agricultural problems down the road. And agricultural prices are still unbelievably depressed, and they have been for 30 years, more than 30 in some cases. So, yes, we're going to have problems down the road. It's been a terrible business for 30 years. In my view, it's going to be a great business in the next decade or two.
If somebody was a young man and came to you and said, I'm thinking about getting into farming based on some of the things you were saying, I've got some land, I'm going to get started in this, you're saying that's a good idea then for somebody to do that? It's going to be a great business, basically.
I think that agriculture, which has been a disaster for 30 years, is going to have a great future. I would not suggest that anybody, woman, man, anybody, go into agriculture unless A, they love it, and B, they know a lot about it. It's not that easy to get rich. Now, if I'm right, it's going to be easier to get rich in agriculture in the next 2 or 3 decades than in many other things. I'd rather be a farmer than a stockbroker for the next 30 years. But that's only if you really love it. I went to the financial community just at the very top in the 60s. And it was a horrible place. And very few people went there in the 70s. And the few who did mainly got washed out of the financial community. I happen to have loved it. It was my passion. That's all I wanted to do, and so I survived. But, unless you really love it, you're not going to make any money in difficult areas. Now, the people who went to work in finance in the 80s and 90s had the wind at their back and made a lot of money pretty much no matter what. Well, if I'm right, that's going to be the way it is with farming now. But still, you could fail. There's a guy on CNBC who's an announcer there who failed as a stockbroker, even in the 80s and 90s, in the great bull market. So people can fail in bull markets and will fail in bull markets unless they know what they're doing and love it. But of the two, finance and agriculture, I think agriculture has a much better future in the next few decades.
Jim, you not only survived, but you thrived. How did you have those astronomical returns when you were at Quantum Fund? I'm just trying to figure out, what do you attribute your success to? Because you didn't have normalized returns. They were just off the charts, astronomical.
Well, I attribute it to lots of hard work, lots of skepticism, enormous amounts of diligence, and persistence. Plus, of course, in those days, we did invest all over the world, which is not that common in those days. I guess that gave us an advantage over some people. But even then, there were people. The Swiss had always been investing around the world. There were people who invested around the world even then. But we had a broader view. We invested in stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities all over the world, both long and short, which I don't think most people don't do that now, but certainly not then. So maybe there was a slight advantage in that we found some niches that were underinvested. It was maybe just a lot of hard work and a lot of skepticism.
You predicted so long ago, and then we'll come back to commodities, but that we were going to have social unrest in the United States. We've already seen that. Is the day of more of a breakdown rapidly? I know you don't want this to happen, Jim, but is a day of more of a social breakdown rapidly approaching, would you say?
Well, I certainly don't want it. Nobody does anywhere. But what I can see is they keep making mistakes. And as you keep making mistakes, ultimately the situation is going to be worse. The economic and geopolitical situation will be worse. And so we as Americans are going to be more and more unhappy. And that, again, is not a radical statement. It's always led to social unrest. We're seeing some now in the U.S. We have seen other countries in the world have seen governments toppled in the last 2, 3, 4 years by what's going on. And I'm afraid that the people in Washington are making it worse. And if it does get worse, as I anticipate, that has always led to social unrest throughout history, everywhere in the world.
Back in 2002, Jim, and I don't know how you made this call. I've mentioned it before, but you said the stock market would trade 5 to 14,000, and it's just unimaginable to me that you nailed that. If you had to guess, I'm asking you to prognosticate. This is where I'm going with this. If you had to guess on this social breakdown in the United States, what kind of a time frame would you give me as a guess?
Well, certainly within the next decade. I mean, that's easy to say. Perhaps sooner. Eric, I know people who insist that the U.S. will have to default on its government debt in the next couple of years. That's not my statement. I don't know because I haven't done the homework. But I do know people I admire who swear to me it's going to happen if that sort of thing starts happening. We have problems at the state level, the city level, and if the U.S. government is in that kind of trouble, whenever it is, whether it's the next 2 years or the next 10 years, it's going to lead to problems. Again, I don't like saying it, first of all. Second, it's just the way the world's always worked. It's not a radical statement. But if suddenly people cannot get food or cannot get jobs, especially, the America of this decade is not the America of the 1930s. In the America of the 1930s, people were still disciplined, hardworking, much more so than they are now. Now in the U.S., there's more of a you owe it to us mentality than there was in America 100 years ago or 80 years ago. So, again, that's not a strange thing. It's just a historic fact. And people with current attitudes are more inclined to be unhappy and do something about it than others.
And if these people you respect that said that, if they are correct and we do default within 2 years, this could get ugly really quickly over here.
Well, of course, and we have an election in, 2.5 years. So, yes, people could be very unhappy and very furious. If you remember, in 1968, there was a fair amount of social unrest in the U.S., the late 60s, early 70s, as America was in financial trouble and had an unpopular war going on. Well, if we're in financial trouble this time around, in the 1960s, America was still a creditor nation. In fact, perhaps the largest creditor nation in the world. Now we're the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. So the safety valves that may have existed in the past in America probably don't exist now, and people are going to be unhappy. And deservedly so. I mean, I'm unhappy about what's going on. I hope everybody's unhappy about it. And hopefully it can be contained at the ballot box and just throw all the scoundrels out. But usually when things get really bad, it has been more complicated than that.
You brought up protectionism in the past, and then I want to close with oil and energy. But first, protectionism. Do you see that as something now that is going to begin to flare up as this economy globally maybe gets worse or these countries run into more trouble? And if they do institute that protectionism, is that just one more thing that's going to exacerbate the collapse?
Well, protectionism has never been good for the world. Nobody in history has won a trade war. Everybody has always lost trade wars. Even innocent bystanders have been unfortunately, suffered. In the 30s, the U.S. started with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which everybody, there was something like 2,000 economists who went to Washington and said, don't do this. it'll be a disaster. They did it anyway, and of course it turned out to be a disaster. The rest of the world then jumped in, protectionism rose everywhere. And you know the rest of the story, the Great Depression. Unfortunately, it started in America again. You may remember a few years ago, America said, oh, you cannot buy Union Oil of California, foreigners cannot, you cannot buy our ports, et cetera, et cetera. So then everybody else started saying, well, you know,